So I just wanted to make a little mini case tutorial on how I edit photos. So this is a photo I had printed, I put on my wall that I like. So I just kind of wanted to show you my process that I went through to make this picture, which is somewhat similar to the other edits that I do for pictures. But every picture is unique, of course. So these are the 3 different exposures that I took with my camera when I was out shooting. And you can see, so this is our regular exposure that our camera would take just on the basic settings, with kind of a neutral exposure where you balance between the light in the sky and the foreground. And so when you look at this, then you can see that we have an underexposure and an overexposure. So I set for 2 stops below and 2 stops above a neutral exposure. So this would be what our camera would usually get with a single raw image, and this is what we want to turn it into. So how do we do that? So the first place that I start is in Photomatix, and I have Photomatix Pro here, and this is the best HDR engine that I've found. So we have to go browse for our photos here. So let me drag this down so you can see what I'm doing. 9920, and so these are our 3 exposures. So I'm going to grab all 3 of those exposures. I'm going to open them, and I'm going to go here, and I don't want to align anything. I took them on a tripod. Even though I took them on a tripod, sometimes it'll still correct it a little bit because there's a little vibration that happens. But I don't want to do that because I need to add on the other images on top of this later, so I don't want anything to move. So I'm just going to click Merge to HDR, and it's going to start working on that. All right, so now we've merged it into the image, so I'm just going to see if I can resize it here a little bit. There we go. Okay, so this is a picture in just the kind of the first step of the process, and it looks pretty good. It's not too bad. I already played with all these settings here to get them kind of where I want them. So you have to kind of go through and figure out where you want these different sliders in the tone mapping processor for detail enhancer. And you can, anytime you want to know what any one of these sliders does, you can just drop it down from the lowest setting to the top setting. So of course this strength is affecting all of these other ones. So how much is it doing each of these? So I usually don't like to oversaturate it too much. I want to compress the tones. I don't want too much detail contrast because it makes it a little too moody, and you can see it's already pretty moody. And lighting adjustments here, this is trying to even it out the most it possibly can. Then this is going to make it as a little more natural, with a little more light in the sky. So I usually want something in the middle. I more often tend to go towards the middle to the right, kind of a little more natural feel to it, because that gives us a more balanced exposure to work with once we export it. And so you can just play with all of these settings to figure out where you want them. These are my different settings if you want to have a look at how I kind of rough edit this. So we click apply, and then it will combine that into an image that we can then save. All right, so I'm going to save this image. All right, so this is the photo we just edited. You can see it still doesn't look quite like this final polished image. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my regular exposure here, and I'm going to grab my underexposure because I want to play with the sky a little bit. So I'm going to copy that. So Control A, Control C to copy, and then I'm going to paste that as a new layer on top of our base layer. And I'm just going to close this already finished image. And then I'm going to copy my regular layer, and I'm going to put that in here, and that'll be our kind of reference guide. And I'm just going to duplicate this because I want that reference way here down here on the bottom. So I'm going to delete this layer. All right, and then I want my overexposure here for the foreground because I'm going to pull some stuff from that. So I'm going to put that there. So okay, so I have these two, my under and overexposure layer on top of my HDR layer, and so now I can recombine those to kind of take away a little bit of this cartooniness that we're feeling here. So I'm going to turn on my overexposure here, and I want to mask out this sky. So I'm going to create a mask layer, and so you can see I just push this button down here. That creates a mask. There's a couple of different ways to do that, and now I have this mask layer. So anything that's white is going to show up. Anything that's black is not going to show up. So I'm going to take a gradient tool, opacity to 100%, and just a linear gradient, and I'm just going to kind of pull that down across there. So now I've just masked out the sky. So now we have our HDR sky, but just our overexposure foreground. And so I just kind of want to blend these two a little bit to make it feel a little bit more natural, and retain a little bit more of the natural color and texture that we had from the image. So I'm just going to drop this down until I feel like I have the appropriate blend of the two. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So about 50%. Now we're going to do the same thing for the sky. So I'm going to turn the dark layer on. I'm going to create a layer mask. And because this is beneath the other one, I'm just going to try to drop it down here a little bit. And then we just want to mask out the bottom part that we saved from the top one. So I'm just going to mask that out like that. And I'm actually going to bring it down a little bit like that. And I actually want to retain that really bright spot in the sky there. So that looks pretty good. And then I'm actually going to drop this one down a little bit more. All right, that looks good. And so now I want to merge these layers. So I'm going to bake all these together. You could just put them in a group if you didn't want to merge them. Maybe we'll do that in case we want to go back and play with it later. Actually, I am going to bake them down. So and the reason I'm going to do that, I'm going to merge that group, is because I have all this dust in my on my lens, and so it creates all these black dots, and I don't want to go through each one of those individual images and get rid of it. So I'm going to bake them together, and then I'm just going to have to do it one time rather than doing it a bunch of different times. So I'm going to take my spot heal brush, and I'm just going to go through and just clean those up. And usually if I was going to print this, I would zoom it in to 100%, and I would kind of go through and I would find every tiny little speck of dust and clean it up. Looks like a missing pixel there. So we're not going to do that. We'll just do the big ones. Okay, so that's the majority of ones that are standing out to me. So all right, so we've got that, and that's looking pretty good, not too shabby. I want to add a little bit of contrast. I'm going to add a curved layer in here. I'm going to brighten up the bright parts. I'm going to darken up the dark parts a little bit. We want it to be a little bit brighter, not quite so moody, so we're just going to keep brightening this up. So you can see on our histogram here, we don't have too many things up in this bright range. Most of it's kind of these midtones. And then we have a little bit of darker colors here. And so I don't want to make them too dark because I don't want them to be black. So that's a good curve layer. I'm going to do a levels, and I'm just going to bring this down to maybe about there. That's a little too much. And then we'll go. So I usually do like 3 and 0.97. So that just gives us a little bit more contrast to work with. And now I want to add a saturation layer. And I'm just going to bump up the saturation just a tiny little bit, just enough to make it feel like we have some rich tones in there. That looks pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is go through the image with the dodge and burn tool and just kind of clean up stuff a little bit. And there's better ways to do this. You can create curves layers and adjust the mask on the curve layer, and that allows you to edit it later on, so you're doing non-destructive changes. But I tend to do the destructive changes, and then I have a backup layer. I'll usually make multiple of this layer so I can kind of go back and revert changes if I need to. That's one way to do it, but I'm not going to do that right now just for the sake of time. So I'm going to take my dodge tool here, and so I'm going to create a big soft brush, so 0 hardness, roughly the size of this thing that I want to brighten up. And I want to brighten up the midtones. So I'm going to set the range to midtones, and this area is kind of dark, but I want that to be more of a feature of the image here. So I'm just going to kind of scan through here, and I'm just going to brush in to lighten this area up a little bit. And I'm actually going to undo those changes so you can just kind of see what I'm doing. So we can go back and forth and change. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm just going to go through and lighten up that orange dirt, because when I was standing there, this was kind of a really bright feature wall. And when I was taking the image, I was hoping that this would stand out. So I'm going to go back and make sure that happens. All right, and then we have these dark areas up front. Those aren't too great to look at, so I'm going to brighten up the midtones there. We're going to brighten up these areas, and this just creates more visual interest in the foreground. All right, and then there's certain areas like these swirls that I really want to draw attention to because I think they're really pretty. And usually I would go in my exposures, and I would really go through my under, over, and regular exposure and pull in the swirls that I wanted from each of those to really make it stand out. This one kind of blended them so they're not quite as clean and pretty as I'd like. And so that just takes a little bit of time that I don't want to do right now. So we can do highlights, and we can actually dodge those up a little bit, make them a little bit brighter, and take the ones that we think are in a contour that really adds to the image. We can add those back in and really just brighten them up and add in some of the rocks underneath the water to really draw attention to the shallow water here that's kind of that pretty rock surface. And then some of these areas here where we have this really nice mid-tone range, this is a really neat, interesting rock architecture. So I really want to brighten up the highlights in these areas to really pull attention to these kind of the more interesting parts of the image. And just kind of out here, this rock feature. So I really want to brighten that up, and especially out here. So we're just going to kind of go through and really pull people's eye to those areas by making them a little bit brighter. And same thing with all of these. We want to brighten those up. And then we want to give a little attention to the sky, because the reason this image is pretty appealing isn't just because there's water, right? That would look like that at high noon, but it's interesting because we have these cloud features which are catching kind of the sun, which is popping up over the horizon and lighting the undersurface of these clouds. So I'm going to create like a really huge brush, and I'm really going to drop this down so I'm not affecting it too much. And I'm just going to go in and brighten up these areas a little bit to add in like a little bit more contrast and visual interest into the sky. And I'm actually going to switch over to my Wacom here so that I can do this with a little bit more detail. So I can add in really kind of variable size, more natural feeling highlights. All right, that looks pretty good. So now if we go back, so this is our baked image before we started dodging, and now here it is after. So you can see that we're drawing a lot more of the eye to different parts of the image selectively based on where we've added brightness. So the next thing I want to do is that I want to add in a little bit of more color to the sky, because the sky is pretty and it's nice, but it's not the sunset I had hoped for, and it actually looked a little bit nicer than this in person. So I want to recapture that. I want to sell the feel of what it feels like standing there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and sorry this is getting cut off because I'm recording in a smaller screen than my screen size actually is. I'm going to go to a photo filter. I'm blind here. Where's photo filter? Here it is. And I want to make that pink area a little bit pinker. So I'm going to do a red photo filter, and I'm going to set it kind of high here. And then I'm going to click on my layer mask, and I'm going to invert my layer mask. And let's just hide this. So now it's black. So none of that filter are showing up. I'm going to take a white brush here, and then I'm just going to kind of paint in the areas where I want that photo filter to come through. So again, I'm going to take a big soft brush, and I'm just going to kind of draw in here the areas that were already red and just make them a little bit more red. So we're just going to kind of slowly add this in here and really bring out those tones that we want to see. And maybe we'll add in a little bit up here. And this is kind of bright area. Maybe we'll make that a little, it's kind of turning purple with the blue. So we'll stick to our bright red areas. And then really on this yellow horizon, we want to show the warmth of sun coming through that. Okay, that looks pretty good. That part doesn't look so good. We'll take away some of that. Switch over to a black brush. All right, so now we can turn that layer on and off and kind of see what it did to our image. So that gives us a little bit more of those red hues that we wanted. And then because this is a layer mask, we can actually go in here to our properties, to our photo filter. We'll click over here, and I can bump that up or bring it down and kind of see how much I want to use. Like that's really bad and cartoony. So we want to bring it to something reasonable here, like 30, 40%, 45 maybe. So that looks pretty good. And now I want to recapture some of the blueness of this water, because if you look over here on the edges, like this water is really kind of that cyan tropical type of blue, and you can see out here, but you lose it a little bit in this thinner water. And when you're standing there, you see the water crashing in, and you kind of see the blueness as it plays off the rocks, but in one static image, you just don't really capture it. So I'm going to do the same thing again, and I'm actually going to use a white balance layer. So I'm going to, where's my white balance? Oh, so here's my color balance, and I want it to be blue. So I'm going to bring up some of my cyans here and my blues, and I'm just going to get that color, that water looking the way I want it to, and then we're just going to go in and back in and add some of that. So that's good, but that affected our whole image. So again, we're going to invert our layer mask, and I'm going to use a white brush and just kind of go and gently paint in the blues that I want. Okay, so we're getting to kind of where we want it to be here. And we can go back and edit this color now because it's that white balance layer, and that will really kind of dial it in to where we want it to be. So it doesn't really matter what you set it to begin with. We could set it to bright red so we can kind of see where we're painting it in, and then go back and change it to the color that we want it to be when we're all done. So I think that looks pretty good. So that kind of took it to where we want it to be. So if we just put this all then in a group, oops, what did I do there? Okay, we'll do this. I'm going to put it in a group, and then we can turn it on and off so we can see that we went from the static raw image straight out of our camera now to this much prettier image that we would actually want to see hanging on our wall somewhere and really make us feel like we were there watching the sunset in person. So I hope that helps and gives you a little insight to how I edit pictures. Thanks.